For some people, any official explanation of an event is always and only a synonym for cover-up. For such types, reality is a labyrinth of shadows and speculation. Nothing is ever as it seems. 1 + 1 always equals something other than 2, and there's no such thing as a straight line from A to B. They live in a world of spies and schemers, of aliens who are never seen, corporate forces who manipulate whole countries, governments who plot and kill their own citizens, and where Zionists or Freemasons, the Templar Knights or Opus Dei, have been running the planet for ages. This is the mentality that argues Roosevelt staged Pearl Harbor, that John F. Kennedy had more assassins than the entire cast and extras of Ben-Hur. It was really crowded on that grassy knoll, and that Princess Diana was most likely done in by members of the royal family, Elizabeth II, the Buckingham Palace soprano.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty. Conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories.
It's the third time I've said that. I'll probably say it 3 more times. See, in my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in, to kind of catapult the propaganda.
I'm Ed Begley Jr. How are you all this evening? Thank you for coming. I'm going to be your host for this evening's program. Welcome to Confronting the Evidence, a call to reopen the 9/11 investigation. I'll be your host for this evening's program. I'd like to ask you please to finish taking your seats as we're going to begin in a moment.
There's much evidence that, especially in Florida, that election was stolen. I don't know that anybody who's investigated this matter would say otherwise. This was a stolen election.
I am proud to have Dick Cheney by my side.
The response of people to the stolen election was that Bush was, in fact, he seemed a bit of a fool to begin with. Plus, he was a criminal in the stealing of the election. Plus, the Supreme Court had overridden laws to steal the election, that is, state laws that required recounts. And so he was an object of contempt, ridicule, mockery, and hatred as he entered the White House. And I wondered how he was going to successfully govern. Well, not only did he have this, they were throwing eggs at him in his victory, you know, as he was inaugurated. Not only did he have this on the plate to deal with, but he also had his best friend and primary financer, the man who ran his transportation with a private plane and so forth, Ken Lay, who was the head of Enron, Enron was now in a period of collapse where millions of stockholders had been bilked out of their savings and their pensions, and it was the biggest corporate fraud in American history, and he was the single biggest backer of Bush. The economy was in a downslide. In August, just a few weeks before 9/11, there was the biggest demonstration in history against the whole corporate trade regime that was occurring with the meeting of the G7 and so forth. There were over 500,000 people present at that meeting, demonstrating against it, and they had warplanes flying overhead. It was like a rehearsal for the 9/11 regime that was going to, post 9/11 regime that was going to come, and that was to simply terrorize all opponents to the New World trade and investment regime, which just overrides all borders and legislations and constitutions. That was very huge, 500,000 people in Italy. Just a few weeks later occurs 9/11.
September the 11th, terror. Weapons of mass destruction. September the 11th, terrorists. The evil terrorists.
Armed with knives, armed with chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. Fanatics, terrorists, September 11th. September 11th, killers, September 11th. Terrorists, Al-Qaeda, terrorists, nuclear weapons, terrorists. 9/11, terrorists, evil.
We await calculation of his talking to lying ratio.
So if anybody had interest in 9/11 happening, the question of, in answer to cui bono, the Bush administration did. Well, we don't just end there, and that question has been silenced. we ask about the explanation of the damages. What were the damages that occurred here? And now there's been much written on this, and I'm not going to repeat it here, but if we do look at the damages, we see that the fall of the buildings isn't plausible by the airplanes knocking into them. 240 external columns, 45 core columns of heavy metal that can't be burnt by kerosene fuel any more than your camping stove can be burned by kerosene fuel, which is equivalent to the type of fuel in airplanes. The fall of those buildings could not be explained by airplanes knocking into them. Their airplanes had knocked into such buildings before. They hadn't fallen. There had been local hits and local fires, and that was it. The subsequent evidence of the damage to the buildings and how the damage occurred indicated pulverizing of the cement. People are saying now that there are many reports coming forth of people hearing explosions inside the building. 40 of the fire people who were involved in fighting the fire heard explosions, have reported hearing explosions. There's much documentation of the hearing of the explosions. But how do...
The day it happened, I saw one fall, and it was just so symmetrical. And I said, wait a minute, I just saw that last week at the, a casino over in Las Vegas, and you see these implosions all the time, and then the next one fell, and I said, hell, there's another one. And they're trying to tell me that an airplane did it, and that's, I can't go along with that.
I did watch the actual film of Building 7 going down, and in my opinion, there's no doubt that that building was brought down with demolition, and when you look at how that building came down, it came down identical to the other two.
But how do we know whether it was pulverized, which would happen within a controlled demolition? We don't know whether that was the case or not, because the evidence for it, all that cement and so forth and metal, which we could have examined in a post-murder and atrocity examination, was very quickly removed, and that was on the hard orders of Rudy Giuliani.
September 11th, September 11th. The terrorists, war and danger. September 11th, terrorism, global terrorism, terrorism, terrorists, 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 the terror, terrorists, terrorists, terrorism. September 11th, global terrorism, terrorists, terror, terrorism. September 11th, world terrorism, terrorism. September 11th, global terrorism.
Removal of all the remaining evidence of what happened to those buildings. And then we have, moving on to the post-event evidence of guilt and what people do when they're guilty. They cover it up, and the continuance of the crime that they had planned beforehand. And we again have evidence that the official conspiracy theory, of course, just rules out altogether the removal of the evidence itself, the stacking of the investigation with Bush, people who are known Bush supporters, the crushing of all questions of what went on, and the accusing of people as being unpatriotic, and the non-stop sequence of planned revolutionary transition to the, which was what the Project for a New American Century had foretold was going to happen. We were going to have a revolutionary transition, but it would be a long transition absent some catastrophic and cataclysmic event.
Bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, bin Laden, bin Laden, bin Laden, bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, bin Laden, bin Laden, bin Laden, bin Laden. There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said "Wanted, dead or alive."
What is terrorism? And terrorism could happen as what happened in America from within.
The hypothesis that is gaining strength, which was said on television last night and which could soon blow up, is that it was the same U.S. imperial power that planned and carried out this terrible terrorist attack or act against its own people and against citizens from all over the world. Why? To justify the aggression that was immediately unleashed on Afghanistan, on Iraq, and the threats against all of us, against Venezuela too.
I created an organization of faculty and scholars to study 9/11,
and I want to be clear on this.
We discovered that practically everything the government has told us about it is false.
I want to get into well, after studying the evidence pretty intensively for 2.5 years, I am convinced that 9/11 was in fact an inside job.
And then when the buildings came down, later on that day, I was with my brother, and I said, hey, call me insane, but did it sort of look like those buildings came down in a controlled demolition?
This huge constituency is not reflected back to us in the mainstream media. And that is an important way that we get to believe something is true.
September 11th was an inside job by the U.S. government.
That goes with it. We are now in the presence of an effort by the United States government, by the Anglo-American finance elites, their allies, and the mass media that are really the most important aspect of the entire regime, to concoct something that can only be called the myth of the 21st century. It is the fantastic, absurd, contradictory, bankrupt, and discredited official account of 9/11. And this, I would submit, is the centerpiece of a new reign of terror.
260 false statements to the Union as he pushed to take the focus off al-Qaeda and have American blood spilled in the war of his choice.
It's hard for me to explain why that was the case. Just take my word for it.